Hello, my name is Connor Conlon. In this review, I'm going to be reviewing the Tokina 11-16mm f-stop 2.8 lens. What I'm going to be talking about in this review is my first thoughts right out of the box, how I like the feel and the look of it, the build quality. And then I'm going to talk about the image quality, the focusing, and in the field with this lens. First thing I want to go over is what did I first think about and what did I think about it right out of the box and right onto the camera. And the look and feel of this, of course, is absolutely superb. This is better than any other wide angle in its class that I've ever used. The build quality is very sturdy and solid. The zoom rings feel very, very firm, very smooth. And the focusing ring is very smooth as well and also very, very large. So it's very easy to grab and use. And like I said, the build quality on this lens is better than anything that I've really ever seen, or just as good from Nikon or Canon with lenses in the same range. And of course, there is no lens in the world right now that is an ultra wide for DX cameras and has an f-stop of 2.8. So that's also very interesting too. This is a very special lens and a one-of-a-kind lens that you don't see from Nikon or Canon or any other lens group. Now, like I said, one of the things that I really like about this lens is how large the focusing ring is. It's very easy to grab and very easy to turn and to use. And as you can see, in order to switch from autofocus to manual focus, though, you have to push it down like that. And now you are in manual focus. You get back to auto, you push it up. That is a little bit tedious, and as you can see, it kind of clunks into place instead of a smooth transition. So it's a little bit iffy, but it's pretty much the only bad part of the zoom ring, and the real only defect that I can really find on this lens. It's just a little bit hard to push down sometimes and not quite smooth enough. But other than that, it works pretty well and it's decent. Another thing that I don't necessarily like about this lens too much is how close the zoom ring is to the camera body when you have it on. It's just a little bit close of a grab for me and a little bit harder to grab that way, but once again, that's not a really big deal. It's just personal preference. The great part about this lens, and probably the best thing about this lens, is how pro it is. As I already said, it's extremely well built, like a pro lens, and it's also got the constant f-stop of f-stop 2.8, which makes it pro lens as well. Much more professional than the Nikon equivalent, which is the Nikon 10-24mm. Nikon doesn't have a lens like this, so that's the closest it comes. The Nikon is not nearly as well built, and of course has a variable f-stop, unlike this, which has a very constant f-stop. In my opinion, out of all the lenses in this range, this is probably the most professional looking, most professional built, and has the most professional style about it. So that's a little bit about the look and feel of this lens. Now I'm going to put it on the camera to give you an idea and to give you some scale. Now here the lens is on a Nikon D3 camera, so it's quite a large camera, and of course for most people the cameras aren't this big, but it still gives you an idea of the size of this lens. And here you can see the front element of the lens. It's actually pretty large. Compared to other lenses in its range, it's quite a bit larger, quite heavy as well, but once again it's very sturdy, and the weight is actually very nice. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to go on to the image quality, and I'm going to be showing you some sample images on my computer, and we're going to look at sharpness, distortion, flare, and stuff like that. Now we're going to take a look at some of the sample images that I took with the Tokina 11-16mm lens on my computer here. First thing we're going to look at is sharpness. Now this is the widest focal length, and it's at the largest f-stop. So this is f-stop 2.8. And actually in the center it's very sharp at f-stop 2.8. And when you stop down to f-stop 4, the sharpness improves. And at 5.6, it's pretty much at its peak. And at 8, it actually begins to soften a little bit at f-stop 8. So this lens's prime f-stop is actually 5.6. So that actually makes this lens not necessarily as good for landscape, but for more low light photography. but surprisingly it is very sharp in the center at f-stop 2.8. However, near the corners it does lose a little bit of sharpness at its maximum f-stop. But when you stop down to f-stop 4, you can see a dramatic improvement in the edge sharpness. And if we go even further to f-stop 5.6, you see another dramatic increase in sharpness. And by f-stop 8, you have the absolute maximum detail you can have in the edges at f-stop 8. And you can see at the other corner here what that looks like. From f-stop 2.8, f-stop 4, 5.6, and f-stop 8 is definitely when the whole picture is in focus. And the great thing about this lens is that it is extremely sharp when stopped down to f-stop 8. It does lose a little bit of sharpness in the center, but not much. It's still very sharp. And overall, once you stop down to 8, it's sharp throughout the entire image and is definitely better than anything you could get from the Nikon 10-24mm lens. But that's probably because it's got a shorter zoom range, only 11-16 instead of 10-24. Now we're going to look at the longer end of the lens. Here we are at 16mm. Looking at the very center, it's very sharp. As we go down to f-stop 4, 5.6, and 8, the sharpness is actually pretty much the same, with 8 being slightly sharper than the rest of them. But center sharpness is pretty consistent throughout the f-stop. But now we're going to look at the corners again, and here we are at f-stop 2.8, and they're not nearly as soft as they were at 11mm. And they're quite a bit sharper in the corners. So this is definitely much better results at 16mm than you get at 11mm, and it's pretty sharp throughout, even in the corners of the frame. But as you can see here, we have 2.8, 4. At 5.6 we see a huge jump in sharpness. It's much sharper at 5.6. And at f-stop 8, once again, you have maximum sharpness in the corners. And we can look at this side too. Starting from 2.8 to 4, 5.6 to f-stop 8 being the sharpest in the corners. And once again, like at 11mm, the entire frame is sharp when at f-stop 8. Next thing we're going to look at is flare. Here we are at 11mm at the widest focal length, and here we have the sun in the corner. And as you can see, flare is decently controlled with this lens at 11, but that's only to be expected with ultra-wide-angle lenses. This is not unusual to see. The best thing to do and to avoid this is just to keep the sun out of the corner of your images, and you won't have that flare problem. And here's flare at actually 16mm, and believe it or not, even when you're shooting almost directly in the sun with it in the corner here, there's absolutely no flare in the image, which is very surprising. So this is a very good performance at 16mm in terms of flare. And you pretty much don't ever have to worry about it, even if you are facing towards the sun at 16mm. Last thing I'm going to talk about here is distortion. And as you can see, here we have a straight line horizon with the fence, and distortion with this lens. Since it's not much of a zoom lens, it has barely any distortion at all, which is definitely a plus for this lens. There is a little bit distortion at 11mm here, a little bit of barrel, but it's not really noticeable, and even if you are taking a picture of a horizon, it's probably not noticeable. And then at 16mm, there is a little bit of distortion as well towards the opposite end, but once again, not very noticeable, not something I would necessarily worry about. And finally, the last thing I'm going to go over is vignetting. We're going to go back to our original images here and zoom in on the top corners of the frame. Now, the great thing about this lens is that it actually has very minimal vignetting, even at the largest maximum aperture. You can see as we get to f-stop 5.6, the vignetting is completely gone. F-stop 2.8, 4, and f-stop 5.6, it's completely gone by then. And even at f-stop 2.8, the maximum f-stop, you can barely even see any vignetting. So that's definitely another great part of this lens, is it's very minimal. Even at 16mm, it's also minimal. Maximum amount of vignetting occurs at 11mm. Last few things I want to talk about before I start on the field photography part of this review is the focus speed and the depth of field on this at f-stop 2.8. Now the focus speed on this camera is very, very quick, just as fast as any Nikon or Canon lens. And I'm going to show you an example of what that sounds like from minimum focusing distance all the way out to infinity. As you can see, that's pretty quick. It is a little bit noisier than Nikon or Canon lenses would be, but that really doesn't matter. It's not all that noisy, and it's very, very quick. Last thing I wanted to talk about is the depth of field with this lens. And at f-stop 2.8, the blur is absolutely magnificent. It's very, very clean and very nice. Just as good as any other professional lens that I've ever used. Last thing I'm going to talk about with this lens is how well it works in the field. Now for outdoor photography and stuff like that, this lens can pretty much take out whatever nature dishes at it. It can probably take some water, it can take dust pretty well, very solid lens, so it can probably take whatever nature hands it, and it'll perform very well. I wouldn't be worried about this lens getting all that battered up outside. But this lens is actually not really for the landscape photographer. The Tokina 12-24mm is the lens that you want if you're doing landscape photography. This lens is for more of the low light photography, ultra wide low light photography, for things like sports and concerts. This lens is very, very good, and it works very well at f-stop 2.8 for a third-party lens. It performs much better than anything else I've ever used that's third-party. So, very good for low-light photography on any sort of DX camera that you have. And this has been a review of the Tokina 11-16mm f-stop 2.8 lens.